Right, okay, welcome back everyone. I hope you had a refreshing tea and coffee. We're now going to carry on to some more discussion of my favourite aspect of the immigration debate, which is what do the public want to see on this issue. And we've gathered together here an absolutely stellar cast to discuss this issue. On my far left, we have James Kanagasooriam from Focaldata. On my immediate left, we have Sophie Stowers from the UK Interchanging Europe. On my right, we have Patrick English of YouGov. And on my far right, we have James Blagden from More in Common. So a wonderful panel of polling nerds, I suppose would be the best word for them, to take us through where the public are on this issue. As in the previous session, if you have questions, if you could use the Slido, there's a QR code up there to put them on there. If you're in the room and you have questions, if you could put your hand up once I ask on that, and we have a microphone that will find its way to you gradually. So I'm going to kick things off by literally asking the question that is on the slide right there to each of our panelists who spend all of their time thinking about what the public want on everything. So, firstly to you, James, what do the public want on immigration?
Thanks, Rob. Very nice to be here today. It's the most collegiate panel I think I've ever been on, where we all know each other and we're friends. So hopefully we can disagree and make it interesting. I think, look, for those of you that have seen the report, the main thing that comes out of it is nuance. So Rob's question is a bit of a naughty one, asking what does the public want as a whole. I mean, broadly, I think I'm quite clear on what that is, which is, the first is, in regards to kind of net migration numbers this year, on balance, the public think that's probably a bit too high as of this year. The second, though, is that what the public really want is a net migration policy that they have control over, which is, again, separate to numbers, because some people are happy with a high degree of immigration, others are not, but the main thing that underpins a lot of it is control. So my third thing, I think, is a differentiated policy on immigration. So the public do not see all groups as the same, whether that's students, whether that's care workers. You guys, that's already been discussed in previous panels, whether that's doctors. Are we talking about dependents, or are we talking about the people themselves? Are we talking about the difference between asylum seekers or, for example, people in small boats, work visas? The public is actually very nuanced on all of these different topics. And actually what I think people are looking for is a combination of that differentiation, control, and then overall a lower level of net migration probably this year. But we don't actually know what the public are happy with on an ongoing basis.
Okay, we don't know. It's a good starter. Sophie, can you improve on, it's nuanced, but we don't know.
Probably not, to be honest. I think the fact that this question is so much more difficult to answer than it was, say, in 2015 speaks volumes about how much sort of the debate around immigration and how much the public's views have changed. This isn't just a situation where the easy answer is to just cut numbers and assume that the public will be happy with that. It's a lot more complicated, a lot more nuanced than that. And I think it's quite hard to think about public opinion on this issue in particular as kind of there's one solid answer that satisfies everyone, because we know that probably more than ever, particularly more than pre-Brexit anyway, that public opinion on immigration is really varied, not just by kind of your political voting intentions or your political leanings, but by demographic factors like age and education, and it's changing quite rapidly. But I think what we do know is that the public probably have a bit more of a pragmatic approach to immigration than they did a few years ago. We know that there's public support, for example, for filling kind of vacancies in sectors like the NHS and care, and kind of having a bit more of a responsive migration system. But I think probably one of the major things that's changed, as James mentioned, is this isn't really a numbers game to the same extent as it was. There's a lot more of an idea about a kind of controlled, transparent, easy to understand system that is responsive to different pressures that British public institutions are facing.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, less of a numbers game, even as the numbers have risen to record highs, is an interesting paradox, which we might want to get into later. So, Patrick, where do you think the public are on immigration and why?
Oh man, this is going to be super boring, isn't it? Yeah, it's, I very much broadly agree with what James and Sophie have said. I might push back a little tiny bit though. Let's interject some controversy maybe. I might push a tiny bit on the fact that it's not so much a numbers game. I think broadly speaking that's true, but there's a superb theory in the academic literature, which, to speak to James' point about collegiality, we spoke about this at a Conservative Party conference panel like 6 months ago, which is the sort of the thermostat idea. Will Jennings popularised it quite nicely in a recent paper, 2009, I think, which is, generally speaking, the British public, or public opinion in general, when it sees too much of stuff, will kind of trend its aggregate opinion in the opposite direction to less of stuff. And then policy response is usually, okay, let's do less of stuff, then let's have less of stuff. And then the public go, nah, do you know what? No, you've gone too far. Now I want more of stuff. And you just kind of get this cyclical loop that happens all the time. And one thing that I've noticed is that in 2022, there was a crossover period in British public opinion, at least in terms of YouGov tracker, as to whether people think that immigration is mostly good or bad for this country. And whereas before it was kind of pretty split across all three categories, we now have a mostly bad lead and it's only growing. And that is, I think you can trace it right back to sort of developing responses on the asylum crisis and people's sort of the issue in the salience of the small boats issue sort of coming up right to the fore. So I think there kind of is a bit of a response to the numbers in general. Perhaps not, which isn't to say that it's definitely not a numbers game, but certainly numbers have gone up, and I think there has been a tangible response, a reaction in public opinion in terms of, okay, that is out of control, and I think the word control is very important. This doesn't feel like the government is on top of this issue, and I'd like that sorted, basically. And to speak to what the two said before me, what sorted looks like is nuanced, and we don't really know what that is.
Right, good. A little bit of tension starting to build here because we've got like, actually, no, maybe it is about the numbers, maybe it is about control versus actually, no, this is a much more complicated and nuanced game. We can't be having any sort of simple, straightforward messages on this. Jim, where do you come down on this?
I'm going to take your question literally, which is where are the public on immigration and where do they live? Because we've run this question through an MRP to predict where the most sceptical parts of the country are, where are the most liberal parts of the country. And although the question we asked, this was about a year ago now, I think a bit more than that, was which statement comes closer to your view? Has immigration enriched culture and society or undermined it? And the public split roughly half and half on that question. But when you look at constituencies, I think it was about 75% of constituencies have the majority opinion being anti. As in, the majority think that immigration has undermined culture and society. So that poses some very interesting questions for politics, because although you've got a country that splits half and half, you have to win seats. So you've got 75% of seats that are sceptical, and is kind of matches, in many ways, matches the distribution of votes for and against leaving the EU, where your electoral coalition is very efficient if you're an anti-immigration political party.
So basically what you're saying is that although the public as a whole might be at a relatively liberal point on immigration, the median voter in the median seat is a good deal to the more sort of controlling immigration sceptical end.
Yeah, all the Liberals live in about a quarter of seats.
So we need to so those who want a pro-migration policy position need to find a way to bus lots of Liberals out to other seats.
Exactly.
Well, that's great, because that also gets us into another discussion I wanted to have. We have like some of the people here who are like really on the cutting edge of public opinion methodology, and I know that they've all done really interesting work in the past few years to try and get under the surface of what is going on with public opinion on immigration. So I was going to come to the three of you, James, Patrick and Jim, and ask what you've been doing recently in the past few years to try and understand this issue better and what you've learned. And then I'll come to Sophie to react and decide who's got the coolest new idea. She can be like the dragon on Dragon's Den here. So we'll start with you, James. What have you been doing in this space in the last few years, and what have you learned?
Oh, thanks, Rob. Well, if you turn to the fourth last chapter of the report written by Sam Friedman, I'm the Chief Research Officer at Focaldata, and one of the things that we try and innovate in is using kind of artificial intelligence techniques to understand public opinion better. One of the tools that we've developed is basically a co-working agent, which is basically a chatbot that can have a conversation with someone. So to mimic basically a focus group. So the person that they're talking to is real, but the person who's doing the questioning is not. And one of the things we did with Sam, and one of the things we've done now across campaigns, actually across the world, is deploy this, because people who charge focus groups charge you £5,000 and you talk to 10 people and it's really great and there are videos and the media love it. The alternative is, instead of talking to 5 or 10 people, you talk to 1,000. And you do so in the course of the night and you analyze their findings with AI. And Sam kind of had a dip into this tool to understand immigration attitudes. And I think for me, it's really interesting. You lose something from not being in a room and talking to someone and looking at the stimulus, but you can get really honest opinions. Think about everyone here. Where are you more honest, on your WhatsApp or a dinner party? And I think what you get is less of a projected self, and what you get is people's really raw responses. And on immigration, we had to blank out a few of the answers that came through. But broadly, what we saw was really instinctive opinion that really cut to the heart of the issue. And in some ways, it was really helpful to triangulate versus public opinion polling. So we looked at 100 2019 Conservative voters. Roughly 80% of them thought that immigration was too high, versus some other public polls that suggested 90. But the key was the language that they used, which was really nuanced, really textured. It wasn't just about numbers, it was about the fairness, it was about control, it was about who was coming. People understood the difference between small boats, and they understood the difference between student visas and people working for care visas. And I thought it was just, for me, it's an incredible tool because of its scale. Like, if you think on a campaign, you think about a political party, those political parties will be running a focus group a night, two focus groups a night. So they'll be talking to 10 people. So over the course of a week, they'll be talking to 70. Over the course of a campaign, that'll be, 420 people. We now have the capability of talking to 100 times the number of people that have ever been talked to during a campaign. Now, does the increased scale give you something different? Well, I think there's a rate of return that after a while you don't get much more. But the key thing is you can get people's real responses. A lot of these campaign slogans and great ideas that you get in politics are actually just a playback from people, because actually people have their own brilliant language to describe where they are. And for me, as a researcher, one of the things that we struggle with is this kind of binary between quantitative research and qualitative research. Quant gives you the what, and often qual gives you the why. Quant is about substantive, quantified truth, whereas we do focus groups because they can really tell us the emotional impulse. The idea that you can merge these categories, I think, this is not a product show, but, but you've made it into one. But the idea that you can merge these categories is incredibly exciting, and we trialed it out in America for working for a Democrat campaign last month in Chicago. And I was a bit scared. I was an AI optimist before. Now I'm not. Because we packed 6 people's work in that would have taken 3 months into 1 week, and 1 person. So there you go.
Well, it isn't a product show, but I'm very enthusiastic about these products myself, so I'm going to allow that. But I did have a couple of follow-up questions. So, as you mentioned, the quantitative data often gives you the landscape, but the qualitative data gives you the map to understand it. It gives you the narratives, the explanatory frameworks that people are using to understand a complex issue. I suppose when you're doing that through an AI chatbot with 1,000 people, part of the challenge is, well, how do you identify the narratives? Is this such a huge mass of data? How do you go about finding out what are the ways people are talking about this? Because in a focus group, that happens automatically. It's just what's happening in the room. But now you've got to sift a lot of stuff. And then once you've done that sifting, what are emerging as the sort of interesting or surprising ways in which particularly these 2019 Conservative voters, think about and talk about immigration that we wouldn't get from quantitative data?
So the difficulty in getting, I think, if I was to summarize what you're saying, a focus group gives you the latent themes of something straight away. So how do you unpick latent themes using text data? And there are techniques, NLP, but also heavy machine learning methods that I can basically parse, but there's like we have 30 data scientists, we have 30 Patricks to kind of look at that and understand what's happening underneath the surface. In terms of substantively from that project, what we got, I think for me the most striking and difficult thing to read, but you should always look at the truth and not hide away from it, was I think a particular quote that we got from someone who said, look, I'm pro-migration, my wife is Indian, but the thing that concerns me is the ratio of churches to mosques where I live. And I thought, that's an insane statement, but okay. And then actually, as soon as you look at that and you actually do look at the ratio, it's very, very predictive of attitudes towards migration, which I thought was amazing. That hadn't even occurred to me. And you get all sorts of hidden snippets of information because we are bounded by our social norms and how we go about work and what we think is acceptable and what's not. And I think for me, that's one of the insights I got. The other insight I got was that people were far more flexible. Maybe I should have read this report, but it hadn't come out yet. What we got was the public are really textured. And actually the same person that can be super anti-small boats is very, very supportive of migrants coming from Hong Kong, people from the Ukraine, and also actually might see that immigration has had some benefits and may actually have personal contact. We think of the 50-50, which is fine. I mean, Jim, we worked on that report together actually, so I understand the need to parse everyone into 50-50. That's what we've done post-referendum, Remain, Leave, these kind of binary tribes. The reality is that almost everyone in the public, bar a very minority on the progressive left and a very small minority on the nationalist right, actually most people cross over, depending on the exam question that's being posed. And I think that's really important to remember.
That's great, yeah, and I completely agree with you about the fact that it's really not one issue. It's more like a cluster of very distinct issues that are understood in different ways. So, Patrick, over to you. What have you done on immigration in the last few years, and what have you learned from it?
I don't have a chatbot, but we do have some very, very cool AI things coming down the track very soon. So watch this space, but it's not a chatbot, sadly.
Not too much product promotion.
No, that's it. I'm done now. If I can link it to immigration, does it count?
Yeah.
No. So one of the things that we looked at, I think it was about a year ago now, or maybe even 2 years ago, when we first noticed that this emergence of, oh no, immigration is doing more damage or is more of a problem than a solution, or that there is a massive problem at least with immigration as it is at the minute, is we started trying to go back to the people that were telling us this, and I guess to speak to the point about qualitative data, and start trying to understand why that was, what exactly it was about immigration that was concerning them, because I think it's quite easy to see immigration going up on a graph and being like, gosh darn, look at all those people that hate immigration. And we wanted to kind of challenge that and test that and say, well, okay, what about this idea? Because of course, as sort of, I think Sophie was alluding to previously, about around sort of 2015, immigration and indeed around the Brexit referendum, immigration was very much a kind of an identity thing, right? Or a feeling, like a cultural thing, like a gut instinct thing. What we were interested in is to what extent immigration and views about it were becoming a valence thing, a competence thing. And the extent to which these people that were piling on top of the immigration concern graphs weren't doing so because they saw immigration overall as a problem, but simply that they were unsatisfied or dissatisfied with the way the government was dealing with immigration as an issue. And what we found was that this was very much the case. A significant amount of people, when we polled at the time, when they said, we asked them to sort of pick what is the sort of most important issue, immigration, okay, how well or badly is the government handling immigration? Badly. That figure was up about 90% at the time, 90% of people telling us immigration was being handled badly by the government. We asked them then, okay, what is it about the way that immigration is being handled that bothers you? And a significant number of people, really, really quite a large number of people were telling us, well, they can't get enough immigrants in to do these jobs. So it wasn't at all the case that a lot of this rise has been driven by, there's too many small boats, so there's too many people coming in from this side or the other. A huge amount of it was, I see all these jobs being unfilled, all these vacancies in restaurants, all these truck drivers, that was a prominent one at the time we were actually doing the polling. So health service, they're struggling because all the immigrant workers have gone. And that's a problem that the government needs to address and get that sorted out as quickly as possible. So for me, one of the most interesting things I've learned and continue to observe in the way that public opinion about immigration has evolved is that it is now a mixture of identity and cultural sort of projections, I guess, or concerns, but it's also a valence issue. And a lot of people look at immigration now, and as has been said, it's not that they're anti-immigration, they're just anti-immigration policy as it is now. And their solutions to that, or the things that really get them het up about it, are very diverse within that. I think it's super important to contextualize that and contextualize what people are thinking and saying when they say, I'm concerned about immigration.
I'm glad you mentioned that. I was teeing up that I hoped you would talk about that exact study, because when I first started working on immigration public opinion years and years ago now, I looked at those most important problem questions, and the BES, British Election Study, and Ipsos Mori had gathered qualitative comments in the same sort of way. In fact, David Butler, the late David Butler, once told me they had to add that question because people were so eager to talk to the survey interviewers about the various ways in which they were worked up about immigration, that they felt they had to capture this information, because it didn't happen on any other issues. The people didn't want to expand, but on this they were really eager to talk about it. And you go through that qualitative data, which you can still get in the archives now, and it is eyebrow raising. I mean, James, you would find a lot of those kinds of comments were being made back in the 60s and 70s too, and in the 2000s when UKIP was first rising. And the sentiment that you were seeing in those comments was uniformly negative. It was entirely, here are the reasons immigration has to come down. And what I think is really interesting about what you did in the recent years is that actually, for the first time probably in British history, you've got a chunk of people who are saying immigration is an important problem on the agenda for me, but what they mean is not enough of it, or the wrong kinds of it, or not where it's needed. Yeah. And that we haven't seen before. And I think we're so used to looking at it as immigration scores this level on important problem, we just assume that's all people who want it reduced, but that isn't necessarily the same now. So that's really interesting stuff. Jim, what have you been doing on immigration in recent years, and what have you learned? You've kind of done your MIP already, so
yeah.
think of something else.
So also haven't got a chatbot, but FT Chat is really cool. You should use it, it's very good. But I'm going to talk a bit about some survey experiments that we've run recently. The first is testing language around immigration and immigrants. We asked a general question, has immigration been good or bad for the country? And then the same, but we switch out immigration for immigrants. To test whether or not people are more optimistic about the impact when it's about people rather than systems. And it makes a small impact, but it's still net negative, which is interesting because the kind of assumption we had is it would make quite a large difference from the qualitative research we do, focus groups, talking to voters across the country. People are very reluctant to blame individuals for the negative impacts of immigration as they see it. But in that survey experiment, didn't find a very large effect. The second was a conjoint we ran to look at what people prioritize.
Could you explain for the audience a little bit what conjoint is?
Apologies. We give people you see a screen, and there's option A, option B, and you pick one of those two options. And each of these two options, A and B, describes a kind of migrant that might come to the country. And we included things like the country they come from, the salary they expect to earn when they're in the UK, the job they'll be doing, those kind of things, whether they speak English or not. So different characteristics. And then you get shown a series of options, you pick A or B each time, and from that we can infer which characteristics are the most important in determining which kind of migrant a person prefers. Is it about the occupation they'll be filling when they're in the UK? Is it about where they come from? Is it economics or culture? Was the idea we're trying to test. And we found that by a long way, the real thing that determines whether which sort of migrant somebody prefers is their occupation and their expected salary. So by far and away, most popular, you might imagine, doctors, and the least popular occupation, I think it was warehouse workers from the list we had. And And then also on income was fascinating. So the most popular option was a migrant coming to the UK and earning about the same as UK workers, followed closely by, well, not closely, sorry, second by a migrant who comes and earns a bit more than the UK average. And then lastly is a migrant that comes and earns less, like far less than the UK average. So that, like, the takeaway there is that people want, it's this sense of, I think, equality and fairness that that migrants aren't out-earning people in the UK. There's a kind of sense of envy can come in there. But also that they're not undercutting wages for those in the UK. That comes out quite strong in that question as well.
That's really interesting because a lot of the rhetoric you hear on the sort of control side is often, you know, the best and the brightest. You know, Brian talks about, you know, Britain being the grammar school of the world, which would suggest focusing on the highest earning migrants. But when you actually sort of test this out in an experiment, it's not the high earners who do best. People are not keen on that.
It's the UK average.
Do you think that's because they have in mind a kind of sort of jet-setting global elite driving around in Land Rovers and buying up all the houses? Or?
Maybe. I think it's the idea that possibly, I think I used the word envy a minute ago, possibly envy, or I think it plays a little bit into the sense that sometimes with immigration, people are taking advantage of the system and getting unfair benefits. In some of the qual work we've done, one thing that comes through quite strongly is this sense that people are kind of taking the mick, let's say, to use that phrase, and not playing by the rules, kind of getting unfair advantages, taking out more than they put in. And that, I think, is why in the conjoint experiment we ran, for migrants earning more than the UK average was less popular than earning at the UK average.
Right, so it's again coming back to those ideas. It's not just control, it's fairness and equality. If the people who, you know, one rule for the rich and one rule for the poor, that's another one of those survey items where 80% of people agree. So people are just assuming that this is a group that aren't necessarily going to be the same as the rest of us, and they don't like that. That's really, really interesting. So, Sophie, you are not a pollster, so you won't have a product to sell us, I believe. But what have you learned in recent years from all the public, you know, you're a big consumer of polling, of course, as part of UKICE. What have you learned from, about public opinion on immigration in recent years, either from these guys or elsewhere, that has surprised you?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I use all these guys' work to write all our reports and stuff, so thank you. And if you want to give me all the data that you've just been talking about, that would be amazing. Thank you very much. Thanks. I think the fact that we've got all these different types of projects and all these different types of methodologies that have all just been talked about, I think gets to the heart of actually how complicated trying to get a good sense of public opinion on immigration actually is, because, as we sort of hinted at earlier, it is so complicated and it does vary across different types of migration, different patterns at different times and so on. And I think what really kind of drove that home for me recently was we were trying to, at UKICE, we were trying to piece together how the salience of immigration has changed over time. So we went back and we found some, I think it was Ipsos, polling on like what's the most important issue facing the country back to 2000. And we were really struggling to find it and we couldn't work out why. And we figured out it was because up until about 2005, 2006, I think it was immigration, asylum and race relations were all grouped as one category. And they weren't separated out until much later. I think until about 2009, they weren't all completely separated out as issues of public concern. And I think you couldn't really ask that same question and group all public opinion on those issues together in the same way now, because it fluctuates so much. And public opinion is so complicated for all the reasons that we've just been discussing, and that, you know, public opinion isn't necessarily negative on net migration, because they want it cut, they might want more. It's a completely different assumption to what we probably were making just a few years ago. So yeah, I think just how much it varies, and also how difficult it can be asked to ask a good question on public opinion on immigration. Actually, you know, that decision of how much context you give to a person who you're asking a question on numbers, because a number like 100,000 might sound huge to someone, but if you put it in context, their opinion completely switches. So just all that kind of debate about what is the best way to get to the heart of public views on this issue, and I think all the different kinds of methods we were just talking about shows how difficult that can be.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I also think one thing that's remarkably under-discussed in the current discussion about migration, Jonathan Portes sort of made passing reference to it in the first presentation, is we've gone from a situation where a substantial majority of migration to Britain was coming from within Europe to a situation where the vast majority of migration is now coming from outside the EU, primarily from India and Nigeria and other sort of Commonwealth countries. When that was last the case in the 1960s and 1970s, it was politically explosive in a way that it simply isn't to anywhere near the same extent now. We haven't seen a big shift against migration because of a shift in the origin countries that the migration is coming from, which I think if you'd have transported someone in the DeLorean from 1968 in the world of Enoch Powell, they would have been very surprised to see that this shift did not seem to have a very substantial impact. Got a question here on the slider that I was very interested to put to the panel, getting onto specifics now. What do you think the public would make of a guest worker program if we were to propose migrants aged in the sort of core working years? There's a lot of discussion about migration as a solution for labour market shortages and so on. Student migration is of course often sold as they come in for a few years and they leave. This was the sort of original logic of the guest worker program. Would this be something that could potentially be a way of squaring those concerns about numbers versus economic contribution? James?
Great question. I think you mentioned students, so let's use that as a case study and then see how that might kind of transplant to guest workers. So I think in the report, we see that actually where the public have moved to a very sceptical position, I think, is on students. I don't think through the fault of higher education, which were told to go out and recruit lots of foreign students to help their finances, and it was marketized. But the reality is that has led, I think, to 70,000 student visas in 2023 with a huge number of dependents. That's led to basically a collapse in public support for the ability for universities to go out and basically recruit from overseas. So 70% of the public are against that versus 30% who are fine with universities to have that freedom. And I think the key here is dependence, because guest workers, what happens to their families, what's the timeline? Again, you're probably all a bit tired of hearing the four of us be like, it's complicated, sorry, we can't really tell you. And you've basically heard that for the last 40 minutes. But terms are everything, details are everything. I think we're moving out of an era of politics where you can just govern with stuff and slogans. And we're now going to head into an era where it's all about the detail and the implementation. And I can imagine a version of a guest worker policy being popular and would entirely depend on the conditions, entirely depend on how dependents depend on the sector. But I think the use of the word guest is an interesting and probably a helpful one if someone wanted to implement that, which I think it really gets to the heart of this sense that having citizenship and belonging to Britain is not something that happens the moment that you set foot in the country. It's a process. And I think recognising that and in terms of the British public is very helpful, and the conditionality around that. I can imagine a guest worker process being helpful, but again, the devil's in the details.
Well, yeah, and the point about citizenship illustrates exactly one way how, in fact. A big difference between, say, a guest worker program where it's like initially you can only stay for 5 years, but it could be extended and then you could be put on a path to citizenship where it was like you're absolutely locked out. So the degree to which there's flexibility about whether or not you can extend and stay is probably very crucial for how that policy goes down with the public, but also how it operates. Sophie, what do you think? Guest workers?
I would just basically repeat everything James said, to be honest. And I think the thing about sector is really important. I think that's one of the things that comes across in the report, actually, is that how much public support kind of varies between these different types of professions. And I think one of the big changes, actually, is how kind of dislocated that is from skill level as well, in a way that it wasn't maybe kind of pre-Brexit. Obviously the public love high skill workers to come here, like doctors and nurses and so on, but actually it's more about kind of filling the gap. So I think was it fruit pickers had really quite high public support, I think one of the chapters in the report shows. So I think it's all about kind of the utility that the public places on the sectors that these people will be coming to work in, with the caveat that it's not just that they want them to go and work in these high skill very professionalized sectors. It's more just kind of wherever they would be most useful.
Yeah, and fruit pickers are interesting because that's probably the closest thing we do have to a guest worker program right now. The seasonal agricultural worker scheme been massively expanded under the current government, and at the same time the public have become more supportive of the idea of people coming in under that scheme than they were a few years ago. So Patrick, guest workers, what do you think?
So imagine a scenario in, let's say, 3-4 years' time. There's a Daily Mail headline and it says, UK government gave out 600,000 guest worker visas last year. Do we think that the public would respond better to that than a Daily Mail headline that says net migration 600,000 last year? I personally don't think so, and for the reasons that have already been expressed, it's in the detail. Now, I can imagine a situation where the Daily Mail headline is government gave out 5,000 doctors' visas last year, and the public will look at that and go, great, sounds fantastic. Can't wait for all these new GPs to be down in my surgery. Government gave out 20,000 seasonal workers' visas. Government gave out this, that, and the other. To speak to the kind of the theme of the panel, I guess, it would work if it's nuanced and it's complex. And it looks as though the government, or whoever is acting this, is actually addressing the concerns of people who say they are concerned about immigration. I think if you take one label off it and stick another one on, that doesn't send out the signal, perhaps, that that is what the government is doing. However, if it's packaged, sold, and processed in a way that says, well, look, yes, we have responded to this, the fact that you probably don't want this, but you do want this, and that this is a problem and this isn't, by having these very specific set pathways for these specific set types of immigrants and workers, and these are the numbers on how many came in, could even turn into a net positive. So that'll be my response.
Yeah, so I mean, it's very true, and we're seeing actually in the current election campaign that you can't really ever judge policies in isolation. It's very much part of the broader packaging that they're sold with, and also the way in which they're implemented. I remember one of the ideas that Sundar Katwala at People of British Future have written about is the idea of having a kind of migration budget day, where you set out the demands and pressures in the labour force and then say, and therefore we're issuing the following visas in the following areas to address these kind of areas, to get people to think about migration in a rather different way to the way that they're normally talking about. You're absolutely right. The Daily Mail headline of 600,000 guest workers wouldn't necessarily go down that well, but in a different framework it would look different even if it was relatively large numbers. Yeah. Jim, what do you think? Guest workers?
It's, well, like any policy, it has to work on the 5-second level and the 5-minute level. So it has to be appealing when you have a 5-second conversation with voters. You get 5 seconds of their attention, you can pitch your policy, and they support it. That's the Daily Mail headline test. But it also has to work on the 5-minute level when they've like more time to think about it. They can ask questions, they can be skeptical, they can go, what about this, what about this? And that's what you get from the kind of longer form qualitative discussions. But I think one of the things that really strikes me is just how skeptical people are generally of any policy. It's very hard to ask people about the most recent policy announcement this campaign because they just aren't listening. So I'm skeptical about the extent to which any particular policy is the silver bullet to fixing public opinion on migration. There's a fundamental lack of trust in politics and politicians to deliver on their promises. And until you fix that, it's very hard to say, here's a great policy that'll just solve the opinion gap on immigration.
Yeah, it's a great point, and it's something I often think of because there were a number of stories a little while ago about how Labour had taken the lead on delivering on immigration for the first time in sort of public opinion polling history. But when you actually went and looked at the detail of those polling, it would be sort of Labour 15%, Conservative 12%, yep. None of the above 65%. So it wasn't a great lead to have in some respects. So I guess that's the question I want to ask following up on this, is, you know, any policy, guest worker policy, anything else, requires the public to actually trust you to deliver. And currently the two big parties of government just aren't trusted in this area. So that's going to make any policy framework hard to deliver. So what could the political parties do about that? If you could offer them advice about how could you actually get that number up from the dismally low level it is now to something that makes it possible to have a good conversation with the public, how would you do that? I'll start with you, Sophie, this time.
I think, not to be too pessimistic, but I think it's so difficult because voters are incredibly split on what they want from immigration policy. So I think one of the things that the report goes into is that there's this balance between compassion and control, and the extent to which voters prioritise one on the other varies quite a lot between, you know, Labour voters, Conservative voters, and everything in between. And so realistically, by pursuing a policy that kind of pleases one group, you're going to inherently displease the other group because you're not following their preferences and what they think is more important. And sure, there's the odd thing around kind of the edges, which are relatively small changes, which sort of, I don't know if I'd say please everyone, but they don't irritate anyone too much. So things like reducing kind of the threshold for dependence and things like that. People across all of the political spectrum are kind of broadly in favour of that. But in terms of, you know, you've got to make that choice between cutting numbers or increasing them to fulfil shortages in one sector. Well, one of those approaches is going to annoy a certain group of voters. And I think just the group of voters that is irritated is going to be dependent on kind of what the government at the time, what their core base of support is and where they live and what they are interested in. And so I think it's hard to kind of get one that broadly increases public support and trust in the government.
Yeah, I mean, it could be one of the things that politicians really dislike about this issue is that you can't actually win over one side in a polarised debate without really annoying the other side. And the risk is you end up with the worst of both worlds, where you really annoy the side you're disagreeing with, but don't actually manage to win back the trust of the side you're trying to appeal to. So, James, what would you recommend to either or both of the parties to get that trust and competence numbers up?
Yeah, I think to try and be a bit clearer, because we've all said immigration is really hard to assess and it's all really nuanced and actually we can't suggest anything, which try and be a bit more kind of punchy here. I think the public is very split and polarised, as you've just said, which makes a huge political cost either way, which is why people, by the way, back away from it. Politicians back away from the issues that are divisive and polarised because they know it cuts across their electoral coalitions. So the incentives to do anything is quite low. However, we talk about competency and delivery. You can't, even if politicians or different parties knew what they wanted to do, they'd have no way of implementing it because we don't have the data or the mechanisms or an agreed approach that can last for a period of time. So, you know, there's been a big debate about ID cards that's coming back. You know, there's no sense that different departments know exactly what's going on. Each department has different amounts of data and information. It's really interesting, even looking at this report, that they don't, the numbers of people who we think have come in is different by chapter, all sourcing different government data. I mean, it's just, it's kind of mad when you think about it. And so I think the first thing, any government of any stripe, and it looks like it's a Labour government, I think would need to get a hold of information, would actually have to know what's happening, who's coming in, then have a mechanism to act on that. I don't know what that mechanism looks like. Is it ID cards? Is it something else? Those are potentially quite toxic, given the debate that we've had before. And then, once you know what's going on and what the feedback loop is between the numbers and then public opinion, and then the economy, which we haven't really talked about, then you can take an actual decision. But at the minute, it's all campaigning and slogans and sentiment, because no one, even if they wanted to do anything, couldn't do anything.
That's very optimistic. Patrick, can you be more optimistic, or is it all doom or
I'll give it a go. So at the risk of sounding like I've just walked out of the thick of it, I'd be very interested, given that we know that obviously parties are disincentivised to really tackle this issue because, as James says, it cuts across the electoral coalition, and as Sophie and Robert said, it's an issue that polarises people, and the political risks of actually doing stuff actively on it for a party in government are incredibly high. It's better for them to back away from it. I'd be super interested in a solution where you actively try to depoliticise it. If parties and governments are the problem, take them out of it. We did that with inflation, right, and with the Bank of England. So, fun idea, why not Office for Immigration that actually is responsible for tracking statistics, that actually knows how many people are coming in and coming out, that actually just knows what the visas are, what the requirements are for the number of doctors, the number of fruit pickers, what have you, that set those limits, that negotiate them, that manage them, that deals with the various civil service departments that actually have to engage with immigration on a day-to-day basis, Home Office, Border Force, whatever, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And would allow governments to then go, or parties to go, well, it's, when those horrible headlines come out, bloody Office for Immigration, it's the same as they do with the Bank of England and inflation, right? And of course, it's political and it's still hyper-partisan what the issues on it might be, but it might allow the government and parties to step back, outsource responsibility to someone that actually has the statutory powers and incentive to do it, because it's their job. So, I don't know, let's try that.
Yeah, someone who's a kind of migration equivalent to Eddie George, who sort of pops up every couple of months and says, well, I've had a look at all the data, here's how many visas we're doing for the next year, and here's why, and everyone just has to react to it.
Basically.
And everyone goes, oh, wish we could
do it.
Yeah, but it's independence.
Yeah. I don't know if that would solve anything, but,
Well, it's certainly a positive idea, putting it out there. Jim, where do you stand on this?
That reminds me of what I did was floated a little while ago, which was having a migration equivalent to the OBR that reports on this on a regular basis, where you have a kind of sort of migration budget. I think you mentioned it earlier, Rob. That feels like it might be able to get around some of the issues, and it would, I think, depends, but could potentially come across to voters as the government taking things, kind of taking it seriously, having a flexible policy that's designed to maximise the benefits to ordinary people. If that's its mandate, that could be a goer. But the main thing that voters want is the government to maximise the benefits for people in the UK and not to be treated like idiots and take trade-offs seriously and have that discussion and really understand what's the best mix of visas for any given time.
I agree. I mean, I'm going to throw my own thoughts into this kind of live public focus group that we're doing here. I mean, I think I've always thought the idea of a kind of migration budget day is a really interesting one, not just because it's treating the public no longer like fools, but engaging with them seriously about the issues, but also because it's actually finally getting to grips with the reality that migration now is really a central part of the story of so many areas of public policy that you can't really have a proper debate about the overall state of the public finances, as Jonathan Portes illustrated. The fiscal headroom that we always talk about is actually very, very heavily dependent on the migration level. We can't talk about the NHS without talking about migration. We can't talk about social care. And then on the other side of the ledger, we can't talk about the pressures on housing and schools and so on without talking about migration as well. And just as a budget is an event that's designed to show everybody, here's the state of the public landscape as a whole, here's where the pressures are, here's what we do, money affects everything. Well, these days, immigration affects so many things as well, but there's a kind of need to have a big heuristic overview of it all. And, the public are kind of there in many respects, so meeting them halfway might be a better way to have a constructive debate. Whether we hive it off to Eddie George or whoever his equivalent would be, I don't know, but I think it's interesting.
You, wouldn't it?
It definitely wouldn't be me. I do not want that job. What was it that guy said? I do not want it, I will refuse it if offered, or that. The president guy, one of the generals said that. Yeah, that's my view on that. Maybe Jonathan might want to do it. He likes a good fight.
I think it's a terrible idea.
So he doesn't want it either.
Wait from the gallery.
It's completely unworkable in my view.
So that's a hard no from Jonathan for being the migration Eddie George, and a hard no from me, so it's going to end up being you, Pat.
Oh, God.
I was wondering if there are any questions from the audience. Where's our microphone holder? So it's just over here first. You've got to come running around.
Shall I try without a microphone?
No, because then the YouTube people won't be able to hear you. You'll be lost to posterity, Jill.
So when British Future undertook the national conversation on immigration, we found that control, which means different things to different people, contribution, compassion and local integration were kind of the four kind of public demands that people wanted. The panel said quite a lot about contribution and control, but we haven't said much about you haven't said much about kind of fairness and compassion. Where do the public stand on wanting people to be kind of treated fairly and kindly, and also what are their views on local integration?
Great question. So we'll go the opposite way this time. So you'll come to you, Jim, first.
On the first one, there's a very strong sense from the public that they want immigration not to work for them and for the UK, but also for migrants themselves. We polled the policy, I think it was where that employers can pay migrants 80% of the UK average wage for that sector, and that polls incredibly badly. People hate the idea that migrants are being taken advantage of and underpaid. So that there's that. And second was on, I think, integration. That, I think, explains a lot of people's view about the overall cultural impact of migration. So the correlation between someone's view on the question, has immigration enriched or undermined society in the UK, is largely a function of their view on whether migrants tend to adopt British customs and values or retain the customs and values of their home cultures.
Patrick?
Yeah, I think fairness, stuff being fair and what is or isn't fair, kind of underpins a lot of where the average Brit makes their judgment from. Like a lot of this stuff to do with, to kind of pivot the conversation a bit, Partygate was such a big issue because people thought, well, that's not fair. I was stuck inside, we were all stuck inside. I couldn't see my dying relative and they were having parties. That's not fair. So I think fairness is a central part of any solution, be it packaged or sort of managed or otherwise, that you need to make on migration. And as kind of Jim has said, that applies to both fair for Brits and sort of fair for people that are already here, and indeed migrants who are already here, and those who are sort of coming or want to come, that the system is fair. And it has benefits for everybody, and there aren't losers from it, because that would be unfair. So I think by very definition of how the British public sort of reacts to stuff, fairness kind of has to be the centre of whatever offer is made, I think.
And it's also about playing by rules, isn't it? Both points,
Yeah.
Partygate and the point about 80% wages. Everyone should have a level playing field. Everyone should play by the rules. Yeah. And whenever people have the perception that that's not happening, then it becomes a much, much harder issue to resolve. In some respects, that's one of the aspects we see with the small boats as well. Obviously there's an underlying structural reason why that's happening, which is a failure to provide sort of a rules-based route. But what people see is anarchy and an absence of rules, and they don't like it. And it's almost like they prefer any rules-based solution to none at all. So, Sophie?
I think the integration question is a really interesting one, actually, because I think it's kind of one of those issues that's maybe decreased in salience a bit, but not through any sort of action of any government to introduce any change or anything. I think because of the kind of shift in migration patterns that we've seen post-Brexit, we've seen people who were coming to the UK are actually going to a very different type of place in the country than they were sort of pre-2016, and that we've got a lot more people working in sectors like academia, IT, professional services, all that kind of thing, moving to places like, London, Manchester, the kind of cosmopolitan, busy cities where, to be blunt about it, probably the people who live there have a lot more kind of positive views of migration anyway, by virtue of the type of people who live in those places and demographic factors that accompany that. And so kind of the salience of integration and how we get different people to kind of live and work side by side has decreased by virtue of that, as opposed to any kind of proactive approach to tackle the issue. And so I think that's quite an interesting question, and how if our patterns of migration change once again to people working in different sectors, going to different parts of the country, whether that issue will flare up once again, because I don't think we've really actually done anything to tackle it.
It's a good point, and I mean it's come up a little bit in the Slido, the issue of like how attitudes are affected by local, where you live, the local conditions you live in. And there's a bit of a paradox about it, isn't there, which is that places that haven't experienced a lot of immigration, often more sceptical, they're less used to migrants in their sort of everyday life, but also the institutional challenges, the local levels of government won't be so used to dealing with them. I mean, somewhere like Manchester, all the schools have large migrant populations. I've lived there a long time, I've seen this. And it's just part of everyday life that those problems, everyone's used to it. It's long been a migrant city, so it doesn't really sort of occur to people as an issue or a problem, whereas if you were living in Boston and Skegness in 2004, by 2010 there's a huge Polish population that's arrived more or less overnight. That will be experienced as a much higher level of disruption to your everyday life. So James, where do you come down on this issue of integration? And
Well, I think just on your first question, there is a poll stat in the book, I think in the Steve Ballinger's chapter, that answers your specific question, which was whether people had felt support or compassion for people coming on small boats, or whether they didn't. And the break was 49% compassion, 45% none or little. So clearly the control versus compassion is like one of the key almost 50-50 divisors in the public, and it's worth bearing in mind those numbers, just to answer that specific question. And then on integration, so I was actually carrying out a piece of work with UKICE and Dr. Alan Wager, who's now at the Tony Blair Institute, on what makes happy communities, and basically ones that feel that they have a lot of things going by them in terms of community life. And the number one thing we found that was a negative that ran across that was lack of integration. And we haven't really kind of gone into that all that much about public services and about deprivation. But one of the key indicators of a lack of support for more migration or immigration is the lack of integration. And the thing that lack of integration is most correlated to is a degree of deprivation and having amount of competition for housing, basically. Usually in semi-dense areas, usually small cities or kind of market towns. And the mapping was done at a really localized level. And so I think that's the other side of the coin. I think the more that integration is seen as the other side of the coin of immigration, right? Once someone's come, that's the start of the story, not the end. What happens then is absolutely critical, which requires a really open public conversation. Like a lot of we talk about London as this, I guess, this monolith, but actually London has some of the highest areas of pro-migration attitudes and some of the lowest. And that's actually only very loosely correlated to the degree of the number of immigrants and the amount of ethnic diversity. Actually, you see some of the most ethnically diverse areas of London actually have lower levels of support for migration because they have less integration. And if you go to Richmond or Wimbledon, which are semi-diverse but not that diverse, but a huge amount of affluence and a high amount of integration, you see a lot of public support for immigration. So I think the story is actually quite complicated and multifaceted, and all these variables interact with each other on that.
Absolutely. We've got time for one more question before I let you all out for some lunch. So I'll take the lady in the middle row here. If you just wait for the microphone to come round.
Thank you. You all still fuss about what the Daily Mail will say in response to a policy, but fewer and fewer people are reading any newspaper, even the Daily Mail. How important is this in how opinions are being formed? More people have direct personal experience, as we heard in the first panel, and fewer people are reading the Daily Mail and similar, and frankly, fewer people are listening to the debates and the parties. So how are people forming their views?
I think it's a fascinating question, the changing media ecosystem. I don't think my children, for example, have ever seen like a daily newspaper in somebody's house. It doesn't happen anymore. I grew up with it, but they've never seen one. So is that changing the politics of this issue, which has often been such a huge issue in big parts of the press, that now a large part of the public is no longer getting their information, their views about this issue from the media? Start with you, James.
Yeah, it's a great question. Elite cues, which I think is what you're talking about, are certainly less powerful than they were. But it's worth remembering both on the right and the left. Many of these organizations produce the content that is then produced downstream into social media clips. and elsewhere. So it's not quite enough to be like X number of people read The Guardian, X number of people read The Telegraph or whatnot. You know, Guardian Online, Telegraph has 1 million subscribers. You know, these are really powerful. They're then repackaged across the entire ecosystem. So I really wouldn't underestimate the power of traditional media. It's very popular to say that traditional media is no longer that important. I think clearly experience and social media now come more into play. So people's lived experience of that, the stories that they tell, the more short form clips that you might see across TikTok or Twitter or Instagram. But also, ultimately, we've talked about how immigration has impacted more people's lives than ever because of contact theory. So I think, you know, not to, I take the very non-patronizing view of people, which is actually they can make up their own minds, they can see the evidence for themselves, they have their lives, they can understand what's going on. And I think there's only so much that newspapers actually lead opinion versus follow it. I know that political science theory is very divided on that issue, and will continue to be so because academics seem to, on this issue, always come up with conclusions that scarily align with their own politics. But I take the view that there's more kind of traditional media following people rather than leading it, but that would be my take. It's a great question.
Sophie?
I think immigration is sort of one of those policy issues that maybe more than most are quite like emotive, particularly through sort of imagery. So if you're seeing, you know, pictures and video clips, it might not be on via, you know, traditional news media or newspapers or whatever, but on social media of people arriving on small boats, for example, or, you know, the RNLI having to go out and rescue people. That's quite an emotive thing to do, and so you might not be so you might not be seeing that through traditional routes, but it's still reaching people, it's still formulating opinions and, you know, sparking debates and conversation. So I don't think necessarily on this issue it matters as much if people aren't using those traditional methods, because the images and the pictures and the stories are still getting to them by, you know, whichever route they choose to use.
Patrick?
Yeah, I completely concur. It's if you trawl through the qualitative text data, as we all do here quite often, you will see Daily Mail headlines or sort of takes quoted back at you by people who don't read the Daily Mail. And that's not because they're lying, they actually are reading the Daily Mail. It's because, yeah, as sort of has been said, the ecosystem of information transit travels down to people who haven't even seen a newspaper in 10 years. So these they'll often have huge online presences, or they'll be disseminated through networks or sort of other ways of information communication. And I think even though, yeah, sort of circulation of physical papers is drops and drops and drops, the information exchange which they generate and the shape of the narrative that they can create, these traditional news organisations, is still enormous. And to that extent, it still really matters how these sort of journalists, how these publications react to the kind of policies that you're making, particularly in the areas that they care about and people who consume their content cares about. So, yeah, I think that's how I would respond to that.
Jim?
Agree. I think you're right, James. People make up their minds based on their experience. And so when we're doing focus groups with voters, very, very rarely do you hear news stories repeated to you. I even ask, have you seen things in the news lately? It's normally a no to anything. But people's view on policy is largely a function of their experience with, say, the NHS daily or their relative experience with it. And same on migration. Very rarely do I hear newspaper headlines repeated back by voters. They do talk about the sense that the area has more people than it used to, the sense that it's hard to, that housing is more expensive, and this is kind of like immigration theory of everything. It kind of tends to come back down to that. It's always rooted in people's experience in their local area, things they've heard from their friends or family, rather than getting their cues from the national media.
Great, so I think I make that 2 people who think the national media still matter a lot and 2 people who don't, so that's a nicely balanced panel. So that brings things to a close. I think there will now be more coffees and possibly some lunch as well, so we can thank our panellists in the usual way.